If you've been hanging out here on the channel for any amount of time at all, you've probably at some point heard me talk some smack about qualifiers. I don't mean to talk smack about qualifiers. I use them all the time in my color grading practice. And to be honest with you, my beef is not with qualifiers. They are a useful tool in the proper context. My beef is with the way qualifiers tend to be used and with the way we tend to teach their use, especially on YouTube. We tend to teach them as a first resort instead of as a tool that is appropriate under a particular set of circumstances. But we've talked about that before in other videos. We're going to leave that alone for today. And instead, I want to focus on an even more fundamental question. What exactly is a qualifier? If we can't answer that, how do we really know whether we should or shouldn't use a qualifier in a particular setting? So that's what we're going to focus on today. Defining, understanding exactly what a qualifier is, and by doing so, understanding exactly when we might want to use them and when we might want to avoid using them. By the way, if you haven't been hanging out here on the channel for a while, if you're new, welcome. My name is Cullen. I'm a colorist. I love color grading. I love talking about color grading. We do plenty of both here on the channel. If you are interested in learning more about color grading, if you're interested in learning more about the color page inside of DaVinci Resolve, I definitely encourage you to subscribe and turn on your notifications so that you're in the loop for all the cool content that we're doing every week here on YouTube on that subject. Let's dive in and talk about qualifiers. So I've already got my qualifier palette open and ready to go here. I'm good to go. Let's start by coming up with the simplest categorization of what a qualifier is, okay? So when we're color grading, we have our primaries, right? That's this label up here. Our color wheels are part of our primaries. We've got our lift and our gamma and our gain. These are operations that affect our entire image in some form, right? There are primaries, there are go-tos, they're what we start with when we're color grading. A qualifier is a form of secondary. Now, what does that exactly mean? What is a secondary? A secondary, in simplest definition, is an adjustment that only affects a portion of the image. So easiest example that I can think of would be a power window. If I do a new circular power window and I draw it over this young woman's face here, anything that I do from this point forward is only going to affect the inner contents of this window. Doesn't matter how hard I spin the wheels, anything outside of the outer edge of this window will not be affected by my adjustments. That is a textbook secondary. It is an adjustment that only affects a particular set of pixels and leaves other pixels alone. A power window is a secondary that is drawn based on geometry, based on space. So it's wherever I spatially position this window, that's where my adjustments will have their effect, okay? A qualifier works a little bit differently. A qualifier does not work on the basis of geometry or on the basis of space. It works on the basis of three channels down here: hue, saturation, luminance. Now, by the way, before I move forward, there are other forms of the qualifier. There's the RGB and the Lume only. We're going to focus on the HSL qualifier here because it's the default, it's the most common, and in my estimation, it is the most useful form of the qualifier inside of DaVinci Resolve. So the qualifier is going to determine who's invited to the party, if you will, who is going to receive the adjustments that we are making, and which pixels are going to be excluded from those adjustments, not on the basis of geometry, not on the basis of space, the way that power windows are, but on the basis of the hue value, the saturation value, or the luminance value of the particular pixel in question. So let's do the simplest form of qualifier that I can think of. We're just going to use our luminance, which, by the way, if you are pulling a qualifier, a great practice to be in is to start with your luminance and to limit yourself to luminance if you're able to get a clean key with it. So I'm going to start sweeping my low end, and I'm going to turn my little magic wand icon up here so that I can see just what I am qualifying. And you can see that as I sweep my low range up high enough, I'm essentially defining the threshold. I'm saying, if you're going to be admitted into my qualifier party, you have to have a value of at least 58.7 or 58.9 or 59. You can see as I'm moving here, fewer and fewer pixels are being admitted into the party because my criteria is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. Does that make sense? So that's all a qualifier is taking this principle that we're seeing here with luminance and applying it in 3 dimensions. So if we were to say, I'm going to set a luminance of around 55, that's still emitting a lot of the image. All my color checker patches are in there. Most of my subjects are in there. A good portion of the background is in there. And if we add some softness, that's just defining the transition point between the pixels that are included versus the pixels that are excluded. So pixels that fall into this range, into this sort of ramp here, are going to receive some, but not all, of whatever adjustment I end up making in this node. For example, that might be fully desaturating things as an easy kind of visual example. Let's turn our highlight mode off for a second. And you can see that's actually affecting visually virtually all of the image, right? There's very little that's being left behind in that bargain. So we could take the idea further now, and we could limit this qualification using another parameter, using another dimension. Let's say that we want to use our hue, which, by the way, if you're looking for a practical sort of guideline for how to use a qualifier, start with that luminance. If you can get away with just the luminance, don't go any further. Next up, start with your hue. You're going to get better results than you will with qualifying for saturation, which we'll see in a moment. Here at the hue level, if I go over to my hue and I narrow my width, let's turn our highlight mode back on here. Can you see color patches are being eliminated? And basically anything outside of my goalposts here, now anything in a teal or a blue or a purple range or magenta, all the way through red, those are all being excluded from the mask. So you can see I started by limiting things based on luminance only, and now I'm limiting things based on hue. And now you really have to be a pretty pure, slightly yellowy green in order to be admitted into this mask, in order to be affected by this mask. And I'm going to add some softness here as well. Softness is our friend with qualifiers. The worst thing we can do when we're pulling any key, which is just shorthand for creating a qualification or a qualifier, is to have a zero softness. Because if you think about it, that means that there's a hard edge between a pixel that is going to be affected by the mask versus not affected by the mask. And that means that when you start to adjust the inner contents of your qualifier, you're going to see those adjacent pixels. So if we like soften out our hue and our luminance qualification real quick here, we'll probably be able to see that pretty fast. Look at that tearing. See how in the woman's sweater here, there's these pixels that are not being swept into the qualification. And because there's no softness, there's just all these hard edges and chatter. This is like the worst possible outcome. This is what we are afraid of when we pull a qualifier, is that it's going to be noisy or chattery. And if this was a motion image, it happens to be a still, but if it was a motion image, we would actually see this noise or this chatter animate with every change in the frame. That's not a look that we're generally looking for when we're color grading. This is why we want to have lots and lots and lots of softness in our qualifiers. We want to take out an insurance policy against ever seeing this, because whatever benefit we are trying to get by going in and qualifying our image, it's going to be completely superseded by the cost of this really torn up image, if you will. So we want to do as broad and soft a qualification as we possibly can. And you can also start to intuit here, you know, I'm doing a pretty aggressive correction for the sake of example here, which is probably more than I would really want to do with a qualification. But I hope you can also begin to see that just having made a qualification with 2 of my 3 channels, it's starting to get pretty narrow. And an image that I like to use when I'm thinking about qualifiers is they are kind of like a scalpel. They are a very sharp, precise tool, which sounds good in a certain sense. And indeed, scalpels are good in a surgeon's hand. You do not want a surgeon to have a butter knife in their hand. You want them to have a sharp, precise instrument. However, if you can solve what you're trying to solve without needing surgery at all, to belabor the medical analogy, you're going to be better off, right? Surgery takes recovery. Surgery carries risk. Same kind of things honestly apply when we are color grading. If we can accomplish what we're trying to with gentler, more holistic means, we're going to be better off. Our image is going to be better served. We're going to get better results more quickly and more consistently. Okay, so we can already see just with those 2 qualifications how narrow and potentially problematic this key is becoming. All right, and if we were to add a 3rd ingredient into the mix, our saturation, we generally wouldn't need to, and the more of these ingredients we add into the mix, the more potential we have for artifacting and banding and tearing. Let's turn our highlight mode back on here. And you can now see that I'm excluding things on the basis of saturation as well. And you can also see that the edges of where my saturation-based exclusion is taking place are not particularly graceful edges. They're kind of chattery. They're going to have noise in them when this image plays through in motion. So that's just another good principle that we can observe after exploring what exactly qualifiers are and how they work. We generally don't want to have more than two, and if we can get away with one, we're going to be much better off, especially if that one is done on the basis of luminance. Luminance is always going to be the way to pull the cleanest key. It's going to be the cleanest of the three. Next would be hue, last would be saturation. Okay, so that's what a qualifier is. All it is creating a mask not on the basis of space, the way that something like a power window might, but rather on the basis of the hue, saturation, and or luminance value of the pixels in our image. It's a really powerful tool. It has its place in color grading, but you can see how getting a really clean key and getting your area affected in just the way that you want and isolating that area really takes practice and finesse, and you have to be careful not to do anything harmful along the way. And just to round out our conversation about qualifiers, the nature of qualifiers, the fact that even when we do a decent job of pulling a decently broad qualification, let's turn our saturation channel off for now and just observe what it would be like if we had a pretty wide hue width qualification and we really softened things out there and we go back to our luminance and maybe we lower that range a little bit. So we've got a pretty soft range here. Even so, it's a pretty chattery key, right? That kind of key that we're looking at right now is why we have these matte finesse tools, which are basically a way of operating on the matte or the mask that we have pulled. So if I switch my highlight mode over into a black and white high contrast mode, it becomes easier to see what these various matte finesse tools are going to do. They're really all here to try to clean things up and make things feel a little bit more serviceable. Here would be my radical suggestion for you. If you need to use the matte finesse tools, you probably should rethink the qualifier that you are pulling in the first place. In my experience, by the time you are having to finesse a pulled qualification, the chances that that is going to be a well-behaved and effective and invisible qualification have gotten very, very low. So that's what we are doing to the qualification. We are post-processing, and understanding that, I hope it becomes clearer why I, as a colorist, would encourage avoiding them altogether, because really all you're trying to do is improve on a very imperfect key that you've created over here. It would be better to pull a cleaner key in the first place, or a simpler key in the first place, or better still, to get the results that you are looking for using broader, gentler means than we typically are going to get out of a qualifier. So I hope that gives you a sense of a little bit of my philosophy about when to use a qualifier, when not to, but more importantly, it anchors that when should I use it, how should I use it, when shouldn't I use it, how should I avoid using it. I hope we are anchoring those answers to a deeper understanding of how exactly qualifiers work, what their functionality is, so that we can understand their strengths and weaknesses. As I said, qualifiers are an important tool in my color grading practice. I would not want to have a version of Resolve that doesn't have qualifiers in there, but like any other tool, they are a tool well suited to specific tasks and very poorly suited to other tasks. So if we can understand how they work, we can have a better opportunity to know when it's appropriate or optimal to use them, and as a result, get better, cleaner, more effective, more efficient color grades. Hope you enjoyed this breakdown of how qualifiers work. If so, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, I encourage you to turn on those notifications down in the bottom right so that you're in the loop about all the cool stuff we're doing here on the channel. And if you have questions on this or any of the other fun stuff that we talk about here on the channel, would love to see you in my Friday live session, Grade School. It's a 1-hour Q&A where you can bring in your questions and I will answer as many of them as I can get to, and we can all continue to grow as colorists.